morning, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the 57th International Making Cities Livable Conference. And this is a wonderful experience for us, a great partnership with the city, and in this incredibly beautiful hall. So lots of room for social distancing, as you can see. We're going to have a very nice time this morning and over the next 3 days. So I know many of you are old friends from way back in the IMCL series. Many of you are new friends, we hope, and we hope that you'll be with us next year. I have an announcement to make, which is that next year will be Paris. You're all warmly invited to Paris. Mark this on your calendars, May 18th to the 21st. And we're going to have a fantastic time there as well. But, you know, the IMCL has always been about going back and forth, learning lessons from each other, learning lessons from Europe, from other parts of the world, and sharing our lessons, frankly, because we're ahead in some ways, in some of our financial tools and mechanisms, legal mechanisms and other things. And we're going to do a deep dive into that this afternoon. I think some of the folks from Baker Tilly will be talking about infrastructure finance and some of the nitty-gritty tools. You know, we all know what livability is, right? What livable cities are. They're the places that we seek out, the places that we love, the places that we pay a lot of money to go to, right? To actually spend time there and maybe move there and start businesses there in those places. But I'm afraid what we don't know is, how do you actually do that? How do you overcome the barriers, the old ways of doing things, the old models, the old elements of what I call the operating system for growth? You know, all the laws and the codes and the standards and the incentives and the disincentives, all this crazy tangle of things that you all know you deal with every day, and you have to sort of unpack those and find new ways to structure your own city codes and your own city standards and ways of doing things. And so that's what we're really going to be looking at. And we have a wonderful opportunity here in Carmel to see how this city has done it, and also, frankly, for you to share your lessons of how you've done it and what you've struggled with, and how you have been maybe unable to overcome something and you want to get some insights from other peers here. This is the whole idea of the IMCL, really, is that it is a peer-to-peer gathering of people who are figuring out together how we do this, how we make this transition that we're all going to have to make, as we all recognize. And I think this moment in history, when we're talking about infrastructure and, you know, what is the world after COVID, is a very important moment in history to assess this. And I think one of the things that's emerging right now, and we'll be talking about that, I know Chris Leinberger will talk about it, is what is the infrastructure of livable cities and towns and suburbs? Suburbs are where most people live, so this is what we need to be looking at and thinking about. So we're going to have, I think, a wonderful 3 days, really a deep dive into a lot of these questions and a lot of these ideas and insights that you will all be sharing with each other, and we'll certainly be seeing the examples here in Carmel as well, and we're very fortunate to be able to be here and be in person together. So on that note, I'm really honored to introduce our good friend and great partner in this IMCL enterprise. He's been involved since 2013, I believe, Mayor Jim Brainerd of Carmel. Thank you.
Welcome to Carmel. I hope that you have a wonderful time here. I'm going to spend a few minutes this morning, and just had the opportunity to speak every morning, and tomorrow morning I'm going to talk a little bit about how and why we built what we did, and talk a little bit about transportation the following day. But today I just want to tell you a bit about our city that I think will help you put it in context. So I will start with this slide. That, by the way, is not Carmel, if you haven't found that yet. But that's one of our competitors. That also is not Carmel, or that one. On the other hand, this is our palette. This is what we have to work with. And I think about that city. They had the same palette, as I say. No mountains, no oceans, and lousy weather. Very similar to Carmel some days, and they did just fine. There we are. Indianapolis metropolitan area is about 2 million people. We're 100,000. When World War II ended in August of 1945, there were fewer, I'm told, than 700 people living in this place. It was a small Quaker farming community. Because it was originally a Quaker farming community, we had no Grand Victorians. They believed in plain and simple things. And had a small downtown of about 4 blocks by 8 blocks, and that was it. When I became mayor in 1996, there was no downtown. This area was non-existent. It was an abandoned strip center. So we took the original area starting in 1996 and 97, made millions of dollars of infrastructure investments. There were no sidewalks. Storm sewers were outdated. There was flooding. We knew we had to fix the infrastructure first. And we knew that the area that would eventually be Carmel was about 50 square miles, which is double the land mass, roughly, of Manhattan in New York City. So we knew the small old downtown was not large enough to be a downtown for our eventual size. So we did a series of public-private partnerships there after we fixed the infrastructure to make that into an art and design district, knowing also that Indianapolis had invested tremendously in the 70s and 80s and early 90s for professional sports organizations and earlier for amateur sports organizations, but had underinvested in the arts. So we made the what we called the Old Town area into the art and design district. You see, we actually did 4 archways, so when people got there, they actually knew they were there, designed a logo, and so on. There are some of the before and after shots in the Old Town or the Art and Design District. Well, you know, one of the things I should comment on that is we try to put together presentations like this, we find nobody took pictures of the old ugly buildings. So I would encourage anybody who's getting ready to do a project, document what you're replacing. We finally thought to do that after the one on the corner was gone and that old warehouse building was actually was being raised. There's another before and after in the Art and Design District. That's the Indiana Design Center, which has about 65 art and design related businesses under one roof with 120 cars underground. I'll talk more about this later. Also in the Art and Design District, we started a public sculpture program, and we used late Seward Johnson's bronze realistic figures to start with. And some people say, why don't you do something edgier? And we have since then, but it was a good way to start because people are comfortable with that type of public art. We had a lot of fun with it. They show up in scars when it's going to snow, and there's a big sports contest. They'll show up with T-shirts and hats with their favorite team's name on them. So people have a lot of fun with them. That was the old town of Carmel, if you've walked on the Monon Trail going north from here, you'll get there in about 8 or 9 minutes. That was our original redevelopment project. Followed almost simultaneously, there's a picture of the old town area. And it's still very small, but our goal was to, and this is always, I think, the hardest part in retrofitting a suburb. It's so easy for a developer to go to the edge of town, cut down some trees or get a farm field, pop up some houses in a retail strip center. What the city has to do is put the brownfield site or the older sites on an equal playing field with the greenfield sites. Because one of the questions we kept asking ourselves, okay, we want to build something like a traditional European city that's walkable, and pedestrian friendly, and focused on people, not cars. Why doesn't that happen in the United States? The reason it doesn't happen, unless there's a public-private partnership between the city and the private sector developer, it's economically not doable for that private sector developer to do that. The lenders won't let them do it. So you've got to figure out a way to look at all the barriers to getting that capital. There's only so much capital in each city. How do you get that capital invested where you want it to go? Quite honestly, in places where you already have $10 million a mile roads, where you already have water and sanitary sewer and stormwater infrastructure, where you already have policing and fire, and I'll talk more about that soon. We did some curb bump outs, got rid of a few parking spaces, and create wider sidewalks. And there's the trail that connects it. It's almost a 30-mile greenway now, and in addition, we've built another 220-some miles of bike and walking trails in our city over the last 25 years. Then we had this, and this is where we are today. That's an aerial picture about 1996, late 96, early 97. You can see we're still building City Center Drive. It's that road to the just south of that old strip center at the top of the picture. That is the road the hotel is on. This was an old abandoned Kroger anchored strip center, which we bought. We closed on that building in December of 1997. So the city ended up buying 88 acres to master plan our new downtown, knowing that that art and design district wasn't big enough for a city of almost 50 square miles. There it is today. Of course, that building sits on a parking platform, cars underneath it, and there's several structured parking structures as well. And one of our goals is always, okay, let's design for people, but we've still got to figure out a place to put those cars. And I'll talk more about how you finance that and make it doable later. We've focused a lot on pedestrian places there. If you look at the picture in the bottom, you'll see how the sidewalks are much, much wider in most cases than the vehicular road. We built the green just outside this building, of course, to be the center of our new city, center of our new downtown. The building on the left is the James Building. It surrounds a 900 car parking structure on 3 sides, so you don't know that the parking is there. Again, I talk about this is Pegcor's office building, one of our partners. It's a national company, but one of our partners in this project. And they built 5 buildings like this. Had we not taken the increase in property taxes from those buildings and allowed a loan to be taken to build the underground parking, we would have had roughly 1/5 the revenue on that site, and it would have been surrounded by a big parking lot. Again, that's an apartment building at the very top, underground parking, again using the tax revenue from the 3-story up 2 stories of apartments on top, then ground floor retail. Townhomes in the bottom right picture. We started that project with and it wasn't that fancy or exciting, but there never been any townhomes built in this city before, really. I'll take that back. There's been one small development years ago. But remember, realtors were saying, oh, those will never sell in a suburb. People don't want to live in townhomes in a suburb. And of course, the developer had a performer that had them selling out in about 2 years. They were sold out in about 70 days, every one of them, 50-some of them. But that was one of the first projects in our new downtown. Of course, then we wanted to anchor again, focusing our economic development on the arts, wanted a true concert hall, the building we're in, as opposed to a multi-purpose theater/concert hall. Indianapolis does not have a dedicated concert hall, and you'll notice this room does not have a proscenium arch, does not have a fly house. It's built for music, not for theater. Of course, we were inspired by Palladio's Villa Rotunda in Vicenza in Italy. We're very proud of this building. It has done everything we wanted it to for the cultural life of the greater central Indiana area, as well as a driver of additional capital investment here in our city center. And so we had these two redevelopment districts, the older area, the Art and Design District, this new downtown, but yet we had some brownfields, abandoned manufacturing places in between. So we named that Midtown. Oops, wrong, there we go. There's Midtown. We actually separated the trail into bikes and peds for part of it. The vehicular roads are smaller than the bike trail. They're only about 9 feet wide, so we don't even bother with speed limits because we know that cars will have to drive slowly in that area. Here's some of the pictures. And this is fairly new. We just opened it up about not quite 2 years ago, the first part. That's Midtown Plaza. We use Suzanne Lennard's formula for the height of the buildings versus the amount of space. We had many people pushing us to make the plaza bigger, but it's one of the most successful public places we've built. It is constantly filled with people. We have outdoor restaurants facing it, everything from ping pong tables and pool tables and a big screen TV. It's constantly filled with life. And it's a place where people from different backgrounds, I've noticed, different economic backgrounds, different countries of origin all come together, and it's a place for them to get to know each other. Different age groups come together in this place, and I think that's so important in our country, particularly now. That's another place that we built that's very special. In the Art and Design District, we built an apartment block, 5 stories, 2 levels of underground parking, but yet made sure we built a public courtyard that is used in the middle of that space. These are the principles we have used over the years, and they're very basic, but we talk about them a lot. Mixed use, less emphasis on single-use zoning, which allows people to walk somewhere they actually need to go. As I said earlier, we try to focus our designs on people, de-emphasize the car while recognizing that we still need a place to store them. We try to pay attention to the hierarchy of buildings. The grand public buildings need to be grand. They need to set the tone. We try to build in harmony with the land and the built surroundings. We try to build on a human scale, which means we don't go over 5 stories. Generally, the way that the old cities of Europe were built before structural steel was invented in the late 1800s. We try to create small enclosures where people feel comfortable gathering and meeting their neighbors. We try to pay attention to the aesthetics. We like detail in buildings. I had this theory that at the time we all got in car, we didn't get over 25% car ownership in the United States until after World War II, between the Depression and then the shortages during the war. And I feel that's when architecture got a lot less interesting. We started to build monumental architecture, but we didn't focus on what I call the everyday detail of making beautiful buildings that people would walk around and actually look at. We've tried to get the density right. Not too high, but still you look at Old Paris as one of the densest cities for the longest time in the world. Plenty of density to make mixed use work. And we've tried to, the car came along, we threw out as a civilization, I think, what had been learned over thousands of years about how to build livable, walkable, pedestrian-friendly cities that worked. And we started to just design for vehicles. And so we're trying to go back and say, okay, how did we do it for those thousands of years before the car came along? And there's a lot to be learned. And so that's what we've done in Carmel. Tomorrow I'm going to be back to start off the program. We'll talk a little bit about why we did what we did and what the community's reaction was and how we convinced the community it was a good thing to build a suburb differently than it had been built in the past. Thank you very much. It's good to see everyone.
Thank you, Mayor. And, you know, it's so great to see how this thinking has evolved, how the practice has evolved here. And I loved hearing that Suzanne Lennard contributed to some of the ideas in the Midtown area. She was the co-founder of the IMCL, and believed very much that we need to share these lessons. We need to dive a little deeper into what is working and not working, and why it's working and not working, and all of those kinds of issues. So I'm delighted to see that we're going to dig a little deeper into these issues as we go forward over the next couple of days. So I'd like to introduce Chris Leinberger, who is a professor emeritus at George Washington University. He's a co-founder of Robert Charles Lesser and Company. He's been involved in a number of real estate development companies, progressive development, walkable mixed-use development, walkable urban places, as he refers to them, which is a very, very important challenge that he has been one of the leaders in helping us to understand how to overcome, and how to actually get the financing to work and the market dynamics to work, and all the other elements of it. And I think he's going to talk about infrastructure, which is so important, the infrastructure of livable places, and at this historic moment when we're talking about infrastructure. So, Chris.
Well, welcome to the first live urbanism conference since the pandemic. Obviously, we're still in the pandemic, but it's so great. So many of you I haven't seen for years, certainly the last 15 months, so it's great to see you. What I want to talk about is the impact of the pandemic on walkable urban suburbs. And we've got a lot of work that we have to do, because the pre-pandemic, we were just flying high and everything was working well in the walkable urban world. It was the dominant way that we were building our metropolitan areas in this country. The pandemic hits, and we've probably lost 15 years that we now have to regain, and a lot of work that needs to be done in the post-pandemic world, and particularly for urbanizing suburbs. So we gray hairs have gone through two structural changes in how we build the built environment. I'm not talking about cyclical, once every 8-10 year cyclical changes. I'm talking about the structural underlying change of how we build the built environment. And when we were growing up, it was the end of the walkable urban world of the 19th and early 20th century. And after the Second World War, we pushed the pendulum all the way over and had this structural change to build only drivable suburban. Fundamentally different. There are only two ways to build our metropolitan regions. That's it. Walkable urban, high density mixed use, with a portfolio of different transportation options, and drivable suburban, one transportation mode, cars and trucks, and very low density. So the late 20th century, we all know, all we did was drivable suburban, and we mandated it from on high. And that's why the infrastructure bill that's being debated back in DC is so important, because what's proposed with the new Infrastructure Act, rather than 20% for what's known as alternative transportation. That's the official language in the transportation bill. 80% goes to the roads, mandated, 20% for alternative transportation for all you hippies out there that believe in a portfolio of rail and bike and walking as well as car. But it's been mandated that 80-20. Well, the transportation part of the new infrastructure bill is 60% rail and bike, and 40% to only improve and maintain roads. So we had this structural shift starting in the 50s, and then starting in the mid-90s, there was the second structural event of our lives as we decided, the market said, we want more walkable urban stuff. And that's why the early 21st century has been the walkable urban era. And the question I pose to you is, are we in another structural change and going back to drivable suburban? So with this, we analyze metropolitan areas using this 4-cell matrix. So I just described the 2 ways to build the form, walkable urban, drivable suburban, and 2 economic uses of land. Local serving, bedroom communities, and regionally significant, where the wealth of our society is created. You're in the middle of a regionally significant, walkable urban place here in downtown Carmel. And most of my conversation for the next 15 minutes is going to be focused on what we call walk-ups, walkable urban places. Now, with the urbanizing suburb, we found that there's 3 discrete different forms that it takes for regionally significant walkable urban places. That in the upper left-hand corner are the main streets. These are the old 18th, 19th century suburban towns that got swept up in sprawl, like Carmel did, but had a main street, had a walkable urban main street. Think Back to the Future, Hill Valley's downtown. And the mayor brought, the first thing he did was he brought back in the early 20th century, or the early 21st century, the old Main Street. That's one type of suburban urbanism. The revitalization of suburban town centers. The second type that we're seeing is the redevelopment of drivable suburban places, i.e. business parks and regional malls. And Ellen and June, following up here, will show you lots of pretty pictures. It's really important to see these models. They have documented, in particular, the redevelopment of drivable suburban places. Huge demand for this. As you know, we have about 1,200 regional malls in this country. Half of them are going to go dark. They average about 120 acres in size. Great redevelopment opportunity, and you won't have the kind of NIMBY opposition because dead malls nobody likes. And then the final, third type of urbanizing suburb is the brownfield or greenfield redevelopment. This is, you just add water and poof, instant urbanity. We're not going to see too much of that, but we do have some examples of that throughout the country. As a developer, I've done downtown redevelopment, downtown adjacent redevelopment, and I've done greenfield development that is walkable urban as well. But we don't need that much of this because we have so much of the redevelopment of drivable suburban places. We don't have to start from scratch very often. So one of the major reasons why we've been blessed in the early 21st century and building walkable urbanism is because crime dropped precipitously over the last 30 years. Until you feel safe in a walkable urban place, you ain't going there. And crime in this country plummeted. Now, do keep in mind that, that I think it's 2019 number looks very low. It's still 5 times more crime than in Western Europe. So don't think that we're so special. We're just getting to the acceptable range. But that was pre-pandemic. We've also studied over the years both, I was a senior fellow at Brookings, involved with the University of Michigan. Doug Kelbaugh is here, who was my former dean, and then at GW. And we've been doing foot traffic ahead, looking at the 30 largest metros every 2 years over the last 15. And so we can track what's going on with the walkable urbanism in the largest 30 metros. And what we found is that in these walkable urban metros, that upper left-hand corner, the walk-ups, have been expanding magnificently. That what we're seeing is that the rent per square foot for office, for multifamily, for retail, has a 75% price premium over drivable suburban. People are willing to pay 75% more per square foot than a drivable suburban place. And when you add what's known as a cap rate to it to get to the valuation, it adds another 40% to that. So we're looking at over 100% that people are willing to buy these assets over drivable suburban. That's pent-up demand. And that 75% premium throughout all the 30 metros, it ranges from 11% to almost 200% price premiums. 200% is 3 times. That's, of course, New York. And that price premium during the 2010s picked up 19 percentage points. So it used to be, back in the 50% range. Now it's 75% range. So it continues to go up during the 2010s. And walkable urban housing has a 90% price per square foot sales price premium because the market wants more of this stuff. The other thing is that 51% of total absorption, total growth over the last 10 years, up until 2020, 51% of all real estate growth went to walkable urban places. And what that is, and in DC, it's 91%. Denver and Boston, 99% of all net growth in real estate went to walkable urban places. This is another sign that the market wants this stuff. And what we've seen is this market share gain is just overwhelming the competition. That it used to be back in the 80s that downtowns and walkable urban places were going downhill while drivable suburban was going up and gaining market share. Over the last 20 years, it reversed. So as I say, we've been in this really sweet spot over a 20-year period. And the other thing is that more and more it's picking up in the suburbs. It started with, of course, the redevelopment of downtowns and downtown adjacent places and universities and urban commercial spots in center cities. But more and more, it's the urbanization of the suburbs. And on average, 17% of all the walkable urbanism over the last 10 years went to the urbanizing suburbs. But places like Miami and DC and Boston, it's over 40%. So if you want to see the if you want to see the future of the urbanizing suburb, besides Carmel, come to Metro DC and get yourself a Metro Pass, and you'll see 30 examples of urbanizing suburbs like this in Metro DC. All of it over the last 20 years. And from a social equity point of view, because this always comes up, gee, isn't this horrible that we have all these, this price premium? The number one reason that we have these price premiums is because we're not building enough. Not enough supply. And by the way, it's illegal to build this stuff. As a developer, one of my largest suburban greenfield developments took 12 years to get approvals, including a trip to the state Supreme Court for the largest zoning overturn in the history of the country. And you have to, the brain damage is just monumental going through that, and the risk is through the roof. But what we found is that the most walkable urban metros, such as New York, Washington, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco, are also the most socially equitable. The reason for low-income households is that your transportation costs are cut in half, maybe by 60%. If you're a low-income household, you're not buying boogity-boogity cars to try to get to work and spend 35% of your household income on transportation. Instead, you're spending 9% of your household income to get to work for transportation. The other thing about the urbanization of the suburbs is that it's happening in really places you would not expect. And that Denver, for instance, was always a western suburban town. They put in a rail transit system, Mayor Hickenlooper got all of his fellow mayors together. You probably don't know, but John Hickenlooper had the best training to be mayor of anybody I've ever known. He ran the largest brew pub in Colorado. So he had all of his buddies come in, he got them a little drunk and said, so what can we do? What's good for Denver is good for the region and vice versa. What can we do first? And at that drunken evening, they decided to put in a $6 billion rail transit system. They funded it locally within 6 months. It's built today. Denver's now the second most walkable metropolitan area in the country. 20 years ago, it was just a typical sprawling western town. And about half of that growth is in the suburbs, but also places that you don't expect, like Atlanta. 30 years ago, Atlanta was the poster child for sprawl worldwide, fastest sprawling place in the history of the planet. And in this last decade, they made a U-turn. And the vast majority of new development in the 2010s was walkable urban, much of it in the suburbs. But then other places you don't expect, like Miami and Los Angeles. Los Angeles in 1945 had the longest rail transit system in the world. By 1962, it was gone. Well, they've taxed themselves locally $140 billion. They spent about half of it. They're putting it back in, and they're serving again the great urbanism of the suburbs. I used to live in Pasadena, and Glendale, and Burbank, and Long Beach, and Santa Monica. And all of these places now have rail transit. There's a subway to the sea being built right now, out Wilshire Boulevard, out to Santa Monica. And the urbanization of the suburbs in Los Angeles is driving it, and same with Miami. And what we're now seeing is all 30 of these largest metros it's a Doppler shift. All 30 of them, even places like Dallas, there's a Doppler shift towards more walkable urbanism. And you can see here that Washington, 91% of the absorption in the 2010s was in walkable urban places that take up 1% of the land in Metro Washington. 91% of new development went to that 1%. In Atlanta, it's 49%, and in Dallas-Fort Worth, it's 21%. But then you compare it to what their base was in 2010, you can see that all of these places are growing 2 and 3 times faster in their walkable urbanism than their base walkable urbanism in 2010, which means that drivable suburban is losing market share. That's what I mean, that back in the 80s, it was going the other direction. And then, doom. The pandemic has changed virtually everything. And it's taken us off track. The pandemic hit March 2020, and you've probably seen these kind of curves. This is the pandemic curve. The rest of these charts are just looking at the 15 months since April 1st, 2020. Here's the foot traffic drop in our major walkable urban places throughout the country. It dropped 65% within a month. It's back up to 79% of what it was in April 1st or March of 2020. It still has a long way to go. And this is the price appreciation. Looking at it from a walk score point of view, you all know walk scores, 0 to 100. If you gotta be over 60, walk score to be considered walkable, best to be over 70. And for the entire 2020 or the 2010 decade, walkable urban places were gaining value over drivable suburban. But in the pandemic, the lines have crossed. Now, this does not say that 90% price premium, it's now maybe 86%. It's not as if it's collapsed. People are still paying huge price premiums to be in walkable urban places. It's just less than a year ago. And so the question that we're all worried about is this the start of a structural shift backward? Now, I don't think it is, but it's something we have to be concerned about. The charts on the left-hand side show for the 2010s, what the price lift was for higher walk score properties. And 88% of the price lift for walkable urbanism was due to the walk score. 88%. You look at the right columns, that's during the pandemic. People are shifting towards less walkable urban places. And when people are moving over the last 15 months, the majority of them went from higher walk score places to lower walk score places. This is San Francisco, which has been affected the most because they've been the stupidest, quite honestly. You probably don't know that Metro San Francisco has been a job machine over the last 10 years, obviously Silicon Valley and all the rest. For every 10 jobs that they created between 2010 and 2020, they built one house. And it's all the NIMBY incumbents saying, I've got mine, screw the rest of you. We're not going to build anything. And so they're getting their comeuppance now. And their folks are moving out to Boise and even down to Los Angeles and Phoenix and Portland and Reno and Sacramento. And on the right, you can see the origin walk score, which on average was in the mid-40s, and it's down into the 20s for where they moved to. Hopefully this is, and then of course the other thing, I talked about crime. Murders have spiked in this country. And here are a sampling of the worst cities. These are not metro areas, these are cities. But murders have, throughout most metropolitan areas, have gone up 25% in 2020, and that trend's continuing in the first 3 months of 2021. Interestingly, there's been no rise in crime. It's still at that low level of 15 months ago for nonviolent crimes. It's just murder that's gone up. And we have no clue why. And keep in mind, and there's a criminologist in the crowd, I had dinner with her last night, and I think she might agree with this, that A, we don't know why the murder rate's gone up today. We have theories, we don't know why. And we don't know why the murder rate dropped back in the 90s. We have lots of theories about it, but there's no consensus. The other big issue is, of course, that the office workers have evaporated. Most of our business districts are anywhere from 10 to 40% of their former inventory of office workers. So there's not as many people on the street. But one thing we do have going for us is we have 1,500 business improvement districts, main streets, and we have safety ambassadors that are on the payroll that are out there trying to retake the streets, to civilize the streets more. And that's going to be our great challenge for the next 3 or 4 years. That foot traffic decline takes eyes and ears off the street. And so office workers coming back, business improvement districts, but hopefully the retail will come back. Most of our business districts, most of those walk-ups in the upper left-hand corner now have a 20 to 40% retail vacancy. Businesses that have gone out of business. We've got a lot of rebuilding to do. So then the big issue is the work from home challenge. And again, here's another COVID graph. You fall off a cliff and then slowly build yourself up. Here is the occupancy over the last 15 months of working from home versus working from the office. And the big question that we're not going to know for at least 6 months is what will be the comeback of offices post-pandemic. I did a study. I was asked by Cushman & Wakefield, the large global real estate management and leasing firm, about the future of office. That was one of the things. This is kind of like, what did you do over summer vacation? What did you do during the pandemic? This is one of the things I did. And they asked me to figure out, why do we have offices? And we came up with these 4 reasons. And they started, of course, with management and being in control, having a control structure over a very large organization. Number 2 is productivity. And that's certainly important, but also innovation. And number 3 is some capital elements, big computers, and obviously computers didn't used to be so mobile, So that was another major reason for offices. You had to go to the computer to work the computer, but obviously now that's completely decentralized. And then corporate culture. What we found over the last 15 months, and I think you all know this, is that productivity held up, surprisingly. Zoom saved us. And in fact, productivity got a little better because a lot of you don't have boundaries between your work life and your home life, and you kept on working all the time. So productivity was a big plus. But what we have seen is that corporate culture has been really compromised. And even probably more important is innovation has begun to sputter. And then finally, young people engaging and learning and being mentored have been crushed. The young people, many people that have been hired over the last 15 months have never seen their boss in person. And you don't have those 5-minute conversations in the hall where a lot of that corporate culture gets developed. I'd liken innovation, corporate culture, and mentoring to be sort of like an endowment where you can spend 4% per year of your endowment and not deplete the capital base. Well, we've been spending 10, 15, 20% of that endowment over the last 15 months. We need to get back to the office to build that back up again. Of course, the question is, how will it happen? And the chart on the right shows what we think is going to happen, that the red is work remotely completely. My son-in-law works with a corporation that has never met. They only work remotely in virtual reality. That's their product line. But we don't think that's going to be more than 10%. On the right, that's 10% of the future will be completely work remotely. But the 59% pre-COVID of working all the time in the office, that's going to shrink completely, significantly as well, down to 10%. So now, in the middle, the 81% will of course be hybrid. And the question we're all asking is it going to be 1 day a week at home, 2 days a week, 3 days a week? We don't know what it's going to be. We do know that it's going to have to be managed, something we didn't have to do before. Otherwise, you're not going to get that kind of corporate culture building, you're not going to get the mentoring, you're not going to get the knowledge, ideas flowing unless you know that your colleagues are going to be there when you show up. So there's going to be much more of making reservations, if you will, in coming to work, or mandates that you must be there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Monday and Friday. It's up to you. So here's my post-pandemic Metropolitan to-do list. As a former, I'm now a former academic, though I was always a quasi-academic. So, and we need to watch these violent crime trends, and hopefully our business improvement districts and our city police will be working closely on that. Obviously, this is a tough time for the police. But the other big trend, of course, is work from home. And I think the fourth quarter of this year will give us our first real indications when people come back for the fall. Once schools are back open and people feel that they have the option of working from home or from the office because their kids are in school, we'll begin to get a hint of that. We need to focus on place management. A lot of you are architects, and I love your designs, I love your urban planning ideas, but 90% of this is the place management to make this work 24/7 over decades. And we need our bids, our Main Street types of organizations, and we're now going to go back and relearn the lessons of the 80s and 90s about how to make these places clean and safe in particular. We need to take our streets back. We need to get the retail back up. Very importantly, we must up zone throughout the country. In most metro areas, it's legal to build walkable urban stuff like this in 2% of the metropolitan land. It's illegal in the other 98% due to zoning and NIMBY opposition. We need to move that 2% to 5 to 7%. And it's the best thing we can do if you care about homelessness, care about affordable housing, to drop the land prices. Land prices is the reason we have an affordable housing crisis. So we need to get more land into the system, make it legal to build what the market wants. And we need to pass the American Jobs Act. Very crucial. As I mentioned earlier, and Mayor Pete, of course, Indiana born and bred, is pushing this right now. It's 60% rail, 40% road, as I mentioned earlier. Very important that we pass it. And we need to understand that we could go backward if we don't work harder to the bad old days of drivable suburban only. So we've got 2 or 3 years of very hard work to allow the urbanization of the suburbs to pick up once again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. So much to think about, and such a momentous period coming out of the pandemic, so many challenges. Just a couple of notes to highlight for discussion later. This question of the cores, the exodus from the cores that you referred to, the idea that we maybe need to recognize that that's going to happen, maybe not just because of the pandemic, but the overheating really of the cores, and that people are looking for a place where they can have their family, have jobs, have an opportunity where they can afford to live, frankly. And so I think it's important for us to build walkable urban places in those places, in the suburbs, in the small towns, and make them more walkable. Maybe that's the polycentric pattern that we need in order to create more affordability. We're going to talk about that on Friday also. Patrick Condon will be talking about some of the questions of urban land and land value contributing to unaffordability and so on. So at this point, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ellen Dunham Jones and June Williamson. They are a tag team. They have a great book from some years ago that many of you know, Retrofitting Suburbia, and their new book, which we have copies in the lobby, Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, is really a deep dive into these issues. And Ellen is a professor at Georgia Tech. She's head of the Urban Design Master's Program there, and has been a scholar for many years in looking at the changes in the suburbs. These are not your father's suburbs anymore. They're not the homogeneous, leave it to beaver places. They have all the same problems of many cities, also many of the same opportunities, economic opportunities. So again, important to make them more walkable, mixed places with more opportunities, more affordability. June Williamson is also a professor and chair of the architecture department at City College of New York, and she's been a leader in curriculum development at looking at how the architecture profession and planners need to think differently about these challenges and need to understand what we need to do to deal with these new dynamics, as Chris was alluding to. So warm welcome to both of them.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Mayor Brainerd, for putting together what promises to be a fantastic conference. June and I are delighted to briefly share our research, and thank you, Chris, for really teeing us up and explaining why we're retrofitting the suburbs. I think the only kind of comment I want to add is that while beloved by many, for 80 years, suburban development has supported unjust patterns of investment and disinvestment, unsustainable lifestyles and carbon footprints, and unhealthy degradation of ecology and public health. However, as more shopping malls, office parks, and other grayfield sites age, they provide opportunities to redevelop, re-inhabit, and regreen suburbia in much more community-serving ways. The retrofits that June and I track in my database are growing in number and in ambition. Chris also clearly showed that. But it was the ambitiousness of the new retrofits that compelled June and I to share these in a new book. So our new book shows how retrofits increasingly are addressing what we've defined as kind of the 6 urgent challenges that suburbia was never designed for. So we published this new book in January, a sequel to our earlier book, and we did bring a few copies to sell and to sign. So this morning, June and I will present a brief teaser of the strategies and the case studies. So the first challenge that we discuss is disrupting auto dependence. It remains job 1 because it has just so many cascading negative consequences that frankly amplify all of the other challenges. There are lots of strategies shown here in blue, and they'll be familiar to most of you in this audience, and many have been deployed here in Carmel. But I want to start with a very ambitious effort. This is one of the case studies. A very ambitious effort to incrementally transfer trips from highway to bus rapid transit and rail transit over a 4-mile stretch of the 8 to 10 lane Rockville Pike in Montgomery County, Maryland. The county is inserting a developer-led street network plan to create walkable urbanism, especially around the rail stations. The dashed red lines in the plan, shown here, are new public streets being built on private land and paid for largely by the landowners in exchange for the rights to build much more densely. Just as Chris explained, those landowners all owned other properties in DC, and they know they'll get double the rent with its walkable urbanism. So on the left are before and after views of the first redevelopment, the first increment of this 4-mile plan. So it's shown in the blue oval in the plans. It was a 30-acre strip mall. It's been retrofitted into the highly walkable and extremely green, sustainable Pike and Rose, also shown on the right. As the new street network gets built out, it will allow the redistribution of traffic. Not every trip has to be made on the highway. And at that point, the county plans to put the highway on a road diet with bus rapid transit in the middle. Now here's another really great road diet, totally different kind of a situation. This is called the Boulevard in Lancaster, California, about 2 hours outside of LA. Like many small towns, the heyday of the shopping malls killed off its main street. Widening the road only sped up the drivers and the decline in the shops. In 2009, the town did the opposite. They went from 5 lanes to 2, reduced speed to 20, took out 9 traffic signals. Sound familiar to Carmel folks? But put the parking in the middle, in between street trees and street lights. By creating a great place and more efficient throughput, the Boulevard has attracted retailers back, increased tax revenues, become a lively event space, cooled the hot desert temperatures, and reduced car crashes. All of which is a good segue to the next challenge, improving public health.
Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here. So the pandemic has highlighted how already vulnerable people are more susceptible. Public health researchers have a wealth of documentation of how the sedentary lifestyles associated with suburban form produce heightened risk of obesity and chronic disease, of dying in car crashes, and of developing addictions. But modest amounts of physical activity encouraged and supported by how places are replanned and rebuilt are the lowest cost cure. We can also make the built environment safer from preventable injuries and from crime, address mental wellness with biophilia and design that encourages and supports social interactions, and reduce exposure to polluted air, soil, and water. And right here in Carmel, we have the example of over 130 new roadway roundabouts, incrementally installed since the 1990s, that have led to reductions in car injury rates, plus time and gas saved from decreased vehicle idling. And the roundabout designs open space for protected bike infrastructure, which improves the health, well-being, and quality of life for residents who use it, even when they fall off their bikes, like I did yesterday. So I'm bruised but undeterred. The next case study of Assembly Square literally addresses reducing auto dependency as well as public health issues, while demonstrating a successful community activist-driven YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard process. So this figure field sequence, an example of the types of diagrams we draw for our books, it tracks changes over time. So from a Ford Motors vehicle assembly plant on the left, which was converted to an auto-oriented shopping mall surrounded by big box retail after construction of an interstate in the middle, which cut off the neighborhoods from the waterfront, to, on the right, an emergent, higher density, mixed-use neighborhood that is walkable and bikeable with waterfront access and a new transit stop. And this Orange Line stop, which you can see in the foreground, is the first new rail station in decades in the Boston T system. And the key idea of the community group called the Mystic View Task Force was that instead of building a single new warehouse-sized IKEA store, which was the plan, was to argue that Assembly Square live up to its name by becoming a place where people could actually assemble together with one another, rather than a place, as it was originally built, where automobiles were assembled. Another challenge is to support an aging population. By 2050, it's estimated that a larger percentage of the US population will be older. The share will be up to 20%, with many more folks reaping the longevity dividend of the 20th century health improvements. There will likely be even more 1- and 2-person households as a result. So how can we address this challenge? Some of the tactics include embrace lifelong community planning models that support needs and desires of residents of all ages and abilities by adding an array of new housing choices for downsizers, allowing accessory dwelling units everywhere, and retrofitting the existing places where people already live with senior care amenities that they can walk to, so not putting those things out in the periphery. Promenade at Wayzata illustrates a transformative redevelopment retrofit from standalone boxes on a fee of asphalt over filled wetlands, as diagrammed on the left here, to a walkable node of perimeter block buildings with green roofs and a great lawn for public gatherings. Most of the parking here is below grade, along with an extensive stormwater management system, given the former wetlands. And it's right on the main street of town, and includes a continuing care retirement community with independent living called Folkestone. It's high-end and expensive and responds to a pronounced desire of area residents with means to age in community. And nearby, also in the Twin Cities area, is a less high-end, more affordable option, the reinhabitation of a former Days Inn motel on a mall out parcel, you can see its location circled there, into memory care units. So we could see these kinds of retrofits happening across Northern America. And the next challenge is to leverage social capital for equity. I hope we all know by now that suburbs are not homogeneously the same socioeconomically. However, they can be highly fragmented and segregated places. They've been systematically structured that way over many decades, and these structures are entrenched in governance, in zoning, and so forth. So social capital's networks of civic trust and social cohesion among people in society provides pathways for individuals to increase happiness and well-being and to access economic opportunity. In other words, social infrastructure. So how can suburban retrofits raise the bar on this particular challenge? I think in re-inhabitation type retrofits of commercial spaces, locally owned businesses can flourish, building economic resilience, including among immigrant groups that are increasingly found in suburbs. Regreening type retrofits can provide equitable access to new public spaces in an enhanced civic realm. And redevelopment retrofits can add and preserve housing affordability and choice. So Wyandanch Rising is an ambitious retrofit, decades in the making, as are many of the more complex and layered case studies in our book. So in 2000, the hamlet of Wyandanch was named Long Island's most economically distressed community. Over this lengthy 20-year-plus process, it's being rebuilt with mixed-use affordable housing around a civic green, on cleaned-up brownfields and former parking lots next to a commuter station. It's got local retail, job training, a co-working space focused on BIPOC-owned digital startups. Features strong community engagement, political representation in the form of a legislative district office for Suffolk County. And the master development agreement included a labor requirement for all subcontractors to hire first from a pool of local residents. One of the trainees was a mother of 3 living in a shelter, and she became a working member of Carpenter's Local 290. Just a few more images. In the middle, you can see the Delano Stewart Plaza at Wyandanch, named in honor of a Black community activist from the community. And then the stair tower of this parking structure by Jeff Speck. It's the first new building there, which was funded by the Long Island Railroad, which freed up then the commuter surface parking lots adjacent to allow this redevelopment retrofit to proceed. So now, back to Ellen.
So now we're going to switch to the challenge of competing for jobs. Suburbia has long been the engine propelling the white middle class. Now that the middle class is shrinking, suburbs are finding themselves increasingly bifurcating. While some reckon with high wages but unaffordable housing and gentrification, others are in a vicious spiral of declining values and wages. Built environment changes alone can't rebuild a more inclusive middle class. Leveraging Wi-Fi and work from home might even the playing field between rich and poor places, but balancing the big, high-wage, office-oriented redevelopments with investments in middle-skill, middle-wage education, small businesses, and incremental development is a good place to start and to possibly future-proof against the 9 trillion jobs that might be lost to automation.
You want to show that image?
Oh, sorry. Was in the wrong one. Based on our research, we see that pre-pandemic, and we expect post-pandemic, we see that urbanism really became the new amenity for office, and infilling aging office parks and warehouse districts with more diverse uses also helps attract many new employers. But not every shopping center can or should be or office park really can or should be redeveloped into a mixed-use town center, especially not in areas of shrinking or declining population where reinvestment in existing town centers would be much more beneficial. So re-inhabitation with more community-serving uses and re-greening can also create vibrant places and help grow a wider variety of much-needed jobs, many of them the small local businesses that fuel circular economies. One example of this is Plaza Fiesta. It's one of numerous malls and strip malls that have become ethnic community centers, catering to the new demographics in suburbia, while at the same time providing way more jobs for small businesses. I'm curious, I haven't been, but Indianapolis's International Marketplace I think sounds like it's a sort of similar place where Plaza Fiesta is located. In Atlanta, it was the 250% increase in Hispanic residents over a very short period of time that led to the retheming of this mall. And then transformed one of the mall's junior anchor stores, was subdivided into 140 small stalls similar to a Mexican mercado. The owner is getting double the rent that he would have gotten from the chain store, and now 140 mostly immigrant entrepreneurs are running small businesses and services. Meanwhile, over 120 office parks around the country are infilling with diverse uses in a more urban pattern to help their tenants attract younger employees. This is one of the furthest along, Domain. It's a former IBM R&D campus 12 miles north of downtown Austin, Texas. The diagram on the right shows how new walkable streets in red have been inserted between the existing wide parking-dominated streets shown in black. So the first phases focused on walkable, mixed-use retail and housing, and now, with that urbanism as the amenity, it's exploding with new tech-oriented office tenants, and another new rail station is planned. Lastly, the suburbs were not designed with climate change or environmental sustainability in mind. And we absolutely need to add water and energy resilience. We cover a lot of important strategies here, and the water ones are really becoming increasingly common. We're still not seeing quite as much regreening or renewable energy implementations as we'd like, but we hope that the examples that we show in the book will egg others on, because on the one hand, the good news is that anything we do to reduce energy use also reduces water use, but also when you regreen, you are tending to improve the adjacent property values so much. A well-designed park increases property values, attracts new development, so you often get the redevelopment, but really only by doing the regreening. Hasselo on 8th is an innovative redevelopment of the parking lots of an office superblock in Portland, Oregon. It recycles gray and black water, that's the toilet water, on site with a living machine and artificial wetlands that are on display in the plaza and irrigate the plantings along the new streets. By diverting 45,000 gallons a day from the combined sewer overflow strained sewer system, this water recycling saves the developer $1.5 million in sewer fees. And the residents of the 3 new 4 to 8 story residential buildings have more bike than car parking. That's very Portland. We need more regreenings. This one shows some of the many benefits. Urban renewal money in 1970 built a suburban-style mall on top of a creek right in downtown Meriden, Connecticut. By the 90s, the pipes failed, flooding the entire downtown repeatedly. Today, the site is a stormwater park, designed a bit like a bathtub to fill with water when needed. The pipes were removed and the creek was daylit. This removed 227 downtown properties from the floodplain. It enabled public housing and the train station to be rebuilt and upgraded and has attracted new private urban housing. It's a great example of how regreening helps meet so many of the other challenges. Now, back to June to close us out.
So, in summary, here again are the 6 urgent challenges. And part 1 of our book is a highly readable, we think, synthesis of the new research over the past decade. And here's a map of the 32 new case studies. Most address layering, more than one challenge, which was a criterion for selecting them among hundreds in the database. Ellen and I have been researching this topic for over 20 years now together, resulting in the Retrofitting series, Retrofitting Suburbia series of books and publications, of which we've shared with you material from the most recent volume, which came out in January. And just to conclude, I'll reiterate what Ellen said at the outset. As more malls, office parks, and other grayfield sites age and become redundant or partially, if not fully vacated, they provide opportunities to redevelop, re-inhabit, and regreen suburban form in more community-serving and productive ways. And we urge you all to contribute to the big project, not only in Northern America, but across the globe, of forging a more resilient and livable future for suburban places. Thank you.